judges, police services, and correctional service providers. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our presenter. Our presenter today is Shelley Gilbert, the Coordinator of Social Work Services at the Legal Assistance of Windsor.
Hi there. Thank you everyone for having me here. I'm really happy to speak to you about this topic. Again, my name is Shelley Gilbert, and I'm a social worker at Legal Assistance of Windsor, which is a community legal clinic in Windsor, Ontario. So just to put this initiative that we have in some context, We Fight has been working with internationally and domestically trafficked people since 2002 and provide a number of different services, both direct and indirect services with regards to human trafficking. One of the main things that we do is provide much of the direct service, much of the direct support, case management, and advocacy supports to trafficked people. You see here we have a number of community partners that work with us and that act really as a steering committee for the project. And these community members are really invaluable in coming together and talking about how they are supporting trafficked people, what some of the best practices might be, what some of the gaps in supports and services might be, and how we as a community can come together and at times have some really sometimes difficult conversations around how we might be able to slightly alter policies and protocols so that we are better able to provide the support to trafficked people that we need, and so that trafficked people aren't falling through some of those policy gaps, protocol gaps that might happen in service provision. The other thing that we're very committed to doing is developing collaborations and particular protocols with the NGOs and with government services so that, again, we can provide the most streamlined type of support to trafficked people. So that means we have particular protocols established with organizations such as Ontario Works, with law enforcement, with our local withdrawal management services, so that we can ensure that if trafficked people access those supports first, we know exactly how that support and how those referrals and what that service will look like to trafficked people. The other thing that we do a lot of is what we're doing today, which is provide some general education and information about trafficking, and then also provide very tailored sort of training, if you will, to particular service providers, whether those are Crown attorneys who are going to be part of providing legal services, if you will, to trafficked people or law enforcement or service providers as well. And then quite a bit of systemic advocacy, certainly with internationally trafficked people who tend to need legislation and policy at the federal level. We partner with organizations like the Canadian Council for Refugees to advocate for effective legislation, and also at the provincial level as well. So we are very, very committed to ensuring that we have a case management type approach with the trafficked people that we work with, but want to make sure that whatever door people come into first, that there is some sort of information, knowledge, and shared protocol to ensure that those trafficked people are met in the place that makes the most sense for them. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page with regards to the elements of human trafficking, I just want to go over briefly what the crime of human trafficking, or what this issue of human trafficking really looks like. There are three main elements that we are talking about when we talk about human trafficking. The first is that there is some process in which the person is recruited or brought to the offending person, to the trafficker, if we will. Very often that recruitment could be the use of force, but it most often does not have to be force that brings the trafficked person to the trafficker. It is a recruitment usually through some sort of lies, through deception, some sort of vulnerability that the trafficker recognizes in their victim, and they use that vulnerability to bring the trafficked person to them. So most often we're finding that recruitment involves lies, deception, some form of trickery, and we'll talk about what those vulnerabilities are that are used to exploit people. Next, there is some sort of coercion at some time in the relationship between the trafficked person and their trafficker. So some form of coercion can be often threats of violence or actual violence, but it could be some other form of fraud, again, deception, some sort of force that must be exhibited on that person at some time in this relationship. And I think it's important to recognize that between the recruitment process and when coercion may be exhibited on the victim can take a length of time. It may take some time before that trafficked person starts refusing to do what the trafficker wants. And it's at that point in the relationship that coercion is exhibited upon the perpetrated against the victim. So in the criminal justice system, that coercion must mean some threat of the person's personal safety. But we also know that in cases of international trafficking, that threat of personal safety could include threats of deportation and those sort of things that are going to put that person at risk. And finally, the third element is that this is for the purpose of exploitation. This is so that here in Canada, it's most often there is money being made off the type of work that the victim is doing, and that trafficker is getting all or most of that money. Most often that is the case here in Canada, that the victim is working in some industry and making money for somebody else. So I think that in other jurisdictions there may be some debate as to who is most at risk, but for the most part, right across the country, we are seeing, and certainly here in our community, we are seeing these groups as being most at risk. And I think we can add to this group as well, but certainly people experiencing homelessness, youth who have or are experiencing some form of trauma, temporary foreign workers who have very precarious status, undocumented people that have no immigration status here in Canada, and men and women working in the sex trade industry. And the reason that I note them, although we could note other professions as well that are very isolated from other communities, if you will. They're not working in a public space. So I'm also thinking about temporary workers who are living caregivers in this circumstance as well. So there are some individuals, due to their workplace isolation, and if you couple that with precarious immigration status, or you couple that with stigma, or feelings that people are already marginalized in their workplace, then they may be at additional risk for people who want to exploit them and coerce them into working for them and not paying them. So I think one of the things that we really want to think about, I think most of us in our workplace are coming in contact with trafficked people, either historically trafficked people who are still living with the trauma of their experience, or currently trafficked people who are in very exploitive and abusive circumstances. So I think one of the things that we want to really look at is where do we fit, or do we fit in a couple different areas here in determining what my role might be in helping somebody who is trafficked. So a lot of us provide information and education. One of the things that we do is go into settings like the Southwest Detention Center here, into our withdrawal management, into rehab centers, and talk to men and women, mostly women, about human trafficking, so that the people that are at risk, if you will, in the group, one of the groups that we talked about previously, are aware of and feel armed with the information they need to protect themselves, or perhaps protect a friend or somebody else that they're working with. So that may be a role that makes sense for some of you. Of course, part of our role then is identification. And when we to those, what I'm going to call high-risk groups, and I put those in quotes, we often, if not always, get someone who identifies to us that they are either currently or historically have been a trafficked person, and again are still dealing with the effects of that traumatic experience. So identifying people and helping them to situate the crime that's been committed against them is very important, both for their treatment, I think, but also to determine if they have any other remedies that they may want to now consider, such as law enforcement. Maybe it's a human rights case when we're looking at certain labor trafficking cases, but we want to be able to identify this first and foremost for the person that has disclosed, but also to consider what other remedies might be available to that person. And then finally, we want to, or not finally, but in addition, we want to consider what sort of treatment then is necessary, because we know both for the trauma itself, for any pre-existing trauma that may have led to trafficking, as well as now the additional manifestations of that trauma, addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. We want to be able to have a handle on what this person has experienced so that we can best provide the support, the crisis intervention, and ongoing counseling and therapeutic needs that that person may have. And finally, I mean, one of my favorite pieces of this work is, of course, the systemic advocacy, which involves some of the prevention and education, of course, but it also involves ensuring that our legislation, our regulations, and our government policies are actually helping to prevent, to identify, and treat, if you will, trafficked people. And so it's very important that we hear from our community partners, even if they are not advocates, systemic advocates in their own right, what they're seeing, what their clients are experiencing, so that we are better able to make the arguments that are needed to ensure that legislation is actually doing what it's supposed to do, which is assist trafficked people. So all of us, I think, fit somewhere or in a couple different places along this type of continuum. One of the things that's really important, I think, for us to recognize is that many of the trafficked people that we have worked with may have been forced into a couple different types of employment, if you will, or a couple different types of workplace experiences as trafficked people. Obviously, many of the women that we've worked with who've been primarily trafficked in the sex trade industry, at times their traffickers have also forced them to work in other industries, such as stealing high-end items out of stores or shoplifting, committing other sorts of crimes, because perhaps for some reason they weren't able to work in the sex trade at that moment. Other times we've worked with, for instance, construction workers in the largest case in Canadian history, which involved Hungarian men trafficked into the construction industry in the Hamilton, Caledonia area. When those men weren't working in the construction area, they were forced to steal checks out of mailboxes. They were forced to defraud welfare. So there were a number of different things that were happening to people. When we look at women that we've worked with that have been trafficked as live-in caregivers, they've also been victims of sexual violence and other crimes as well. So it's really important that when we are working with trafficked people, we're sort of open to who we might be seeing, what experience they may be prepared to discuss now, but be open to and provide them the opportunities to disclose other areas that they may have been forced to work in. For instance, moving drugs for their trafficker. This might be something that someone isn't going to immediately admit to because they are committing a criminal offense, but understanding that this might be someone who is being forced, who is under threat, who is experiencing violence, and that's why they're doing that at this point, I think is really important for us to understand and be able to interview in a way that people feel comfortable to disclose, either immediately or later on in your relationship with them. One of the things that we really are trying to look at in working specifically in labor trafficking is that there is a continuum of exploitation that labor trafficked people who are actually trafficked people, even though it's in labor specifically, experience very often. Most of us, and I hope you could see this slide okay, most of us, I hope, are working in the very first bubble there, which is decent work. So we want to have a fair income, we want to feel productive, we want equal opportunities in our protections and in our workplace. Most of the temporary foreign workers that we're working with who come as temporary foreign workers, who come with legitimate immigration status, often experience exploitation in the next number of bubbles going down. They may initially discuss labor law violations or what appear to be labor law violations. So those may include not being given overtime, they may include not having vacation pay, and we really have to look at what their contract is, what the employment standards legislation says specifically for their job as temporary foreign workers, because there's many, many exceptions for them specifically in those laws. But they may have specific labor law violations and want to access a remedy under employment standards. Then as we meet with people, we may start hearing from them some additional what we would consider human rights types violations. So we may have someone who is fired because she becomes pregnant. We may have certain circumstances where workers are segregated as a result because of their race or because of their country of origin. We may see really different pay scales based on based on the fact that they are temporary foreign workers as opposed to Canadian workers. So more human rights violations as well as the labor law violations that we may see. And then those again may roll into what we might consider more criminal code violations, such as fraud, extortion, taking of people's identification, and then we might want to consider with our client whether they want to access a remedy with law enforcement and the criminal justice system. It doesn't prevent them necessarily from considering their other remedies as well. We really try to respect the wishes, of course, of the person that we're working with and really provide as much information and education around the systems as we can. And then finally, we may be speaking to people around what we would consider trafficking in labor. And that's obvious signs of coercion, of not doing voluntary type of work, of threats especially, and including threats of firing and deportation, as well as feeling unsafe either in their workplace or as well in their home. There is usually a lot of monitoring of their movements and restriction of their movements, both in the workplace and in their housing. So we would consider all of these elements and discuss with them what the various remedies might be and what their wishes are at that point before moving forward, whether it's calling in law enforcement or beginning a process with regards to those other remedies. But I think it's important for us to recognize that initially workers in this circumstance are not always coming in and disclosing labor trafficking off the first meeting, and may have a comfort level or trying to determine what that exploitation looks like and feel more comfortable in disclosing those initial bubbles, if you will, and elements within those other bubbles before feeling comfortable in talking about some of the threats of coercion, some of the actual coercion that's happening to them, and some of the fears that they have associated with what's happening in their home and in their workplace. One of the areas of trafficking that I think is really under-recognized, it certainly is in the criminal justice system, and I think for most of us, is marriage as trafficking as well. This is very, very different than arranged marriage. It is not the same at all. We're talking most often about circumstances of really extended family violence that includes the forcing, usually of a woman, but not necessarily, the forcing of a woman into marriage for various reasons. So earlier when we spoke about what the elements of trafficking were, I spoke about the fact that most often money is being exchanged. But in these circumstances, we have other reasons or other forms of exploitation at the end of this. For instance, it might be that families will have sort of an exalted community contacts within their own community or business contacts as a result of forcing the marriage between their child and another person. So it's really important that we're very open to what we're seeing, especially in cases of domestic violence, if you will. I think that these cases often come forward as domestic violence to NGOs and to law enforcement, but it's important that we have a sense of what marriage as trafficking might look like. So again, we can interview people with that sort of lens. So this is actually, you know, I certainly know that we have worked with a number of women and one man at the time who have been, we consider trafficking in marriage. But really there are other experts in Ontario, the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario and Barbara Schleifer Clinic in Toronto, who have both done some really excellent work in the area of marriage as trafficking as well. So I urge you, if this is a particular focus for you, to contact them or see some of the work that they may have online. So this slide is specifically speaking about a study that those organizations did here in Ontario between 2010 and 2012, and really looking at the fact that I think it's important for us to recognize that half were Canadian citizens at the time that this was happening. And again, that these were extended forms of family violence being imposed upon the young person in their family. So this, again, is not an arranged marriage. This is forcing a young person to marry a particular person, and someone is exploiting that marriage for some reason. So what we've tried to do in this community, and really this type of continuum, similar to the one that we do on labor trafficking, is to, and this is specific for our community here, so again, there may be some other risk factors in your own community you want to consider, but really we put this together so that organizations that are working with us can determine what, again, is my role. If I'm a children's aid worker, for instance, what would be my role as opposed to contacting We Fight, contacting Legal Assistance of Windsor for some additional support. We're obviously always open to having consultations, but we wanted to provide our community partners with a sense of what we might all be able to do together, what you might be able to do specifically to support, to either prevent or identify or treat someone who has experienced trafficking currently or in their past. So again, other communities may have slightly different risk factors, but we continue to see the young people that we're working with. We have one worker here that works only with young people under the age of 24, but both for her and for the work that I do and the other project coordinator for We Fight, we're seeing that there has always some children's aid involvement, if you will, either for yourself as a child and or your children. So there is some pre-existing trauma, I think we are recognizing here, which prompted the children's aid involvement in the first place, that is linked to the potential for trafficking later in someone's life. With that, of course, leads to a whole host of what we would consider self-esteem type issues as well, and of course, poverty, right? So whether you are an internationally trafficked person, you are an indigenous person from this land, you are a person, Canadian citizen living in poverty here, poverty can be a risk factor that would make you feel desperate enough to take a risk with someone. So it is certainly a risk factor. Next, we look at, in the low risk category, if you will, we're looking at the friends and family that are very involved in the drug culture, that have perhaps substance misuse, because that's how debts start, isn't it? It's one of the ways that debts can start. So we want to look at that as a risk factor, a slightly higher than at-risk factor. When someone has a history of group homes and foster care, we're looking at some real instability in their life, of course, We're looking at a really vulnerable group of people. We're looking at a group of people, if you're living in a group home where traffickers can often prey on and know that there are a number of young teenage boys or teenage girls that are extremely vulnerable and can be preyed upon in those group homes. So we would look at that. I've worked with a number of young girls who, even once they were home with their family, were recruited by other young women that they lived with in the group homes. So we know that this is a high-risk category or a risk category for us here. Of course, we move into others when we look at medium risk, so unexplained injuries, of course, incidences of self-harm. For a mom whose children are apprehended by Children's Aid, if we couple that with drug use, homelessness, etc., then we're looking at a number of risk factors. For moms, once your kids are taken, everything sort of falls apart, right? You are more likely to experience homelessness at that point. You may have debts and legal issues that you're trying to deal with, and you have nothing left to sort of hold it together. So that becomes a medium risk factor for us. And finally, in high-risk situations, if there are obvious signs of coercion, if there are threats in relation to those other factors that we've talked about, if somebody's disclosing, working with someone who, we'll say a pimp or a trafficker, but in a circumstance in which their money is being taken, in a circumstance in which they don't control the acts that they're performing, they don't control the hours that they're working, that to us would be a trafficking circumstance, as well as, you know, obvious threats if you're not working, coercion if you're not working, violence if you're not working, and those sort of things. So that's sort of what we use, and specifically we use this with the Children's Aid Society, but with other youth-serving organizations to try and determine where their clients might fit, and then they can determine within their own organization what supports they might be able to provide, as well as contacting our support as well, and we fight specifically to provide any additional supports or specialized supports if that young person needs. So in looking at, we've talked a little bit about these three elements, but really want to think about, you know, what, I don't want to give anyone an exhausted list of what recruitment strategies are or vulnerabilities or coercion or exploitation list, but to give a sort of overview, if you will, of what these strategies look like. I think the most obvious recruitment strategy, whether you are being recruited into the sex trade industry, certainly internationally trafficked people into labor circumstances, is poverty. When someone is experiencing extreme poverty, it is for that reason that they are likely to come to Canada, for instance, as temporary foreign workers. They want to feed their kids. They want to pay for their parents' medical bills. And the recruiters often recognize, or the traffickers recognize, that the lack of opportunities in country of origin, the inability to take care of your family, any mother or father is going to risk coming to Canada. And so the recruitment strategy is simple. No form of coercion is necessary. You will play on people's poverty. But that has certainly been the case as well in other circumstances of Canadian citizens as well. So we have to really begin dealing with the issues of poverty in our communities in order to try and combat some of what's happening. Lack of options for self, certainly. Lack of opportunities, or feeling like you have no options, feelings of helplessness and hopelessness for Canadians, I think. But lack of options that are realities for people in other countries of origin as well. And so, you know, one of the strategies that the traffickers used in the trafficking of Hungarian men was the fact that those young men were not going to be able to finish high school. They weren't going to be able to get work. They weren't going to be able to get into trade opportunities or education systems. And so that lack of opportunity and feeling of helplessness was really used by the traffickers to bring people to Canada. Substance misuse is another recruitment strategy. So certainly for some and I'm thinking specifically about women who are trafficked into the sex trade industry. The substance misuse is used as a way to recruit people. Very often we're seeing young people who don't, and young women who are not aware of the fact, or because of their substance misuse, don't think about the fact at the time that they are going to have to pay that drug use debt back. And it's only once they have utilized the drugs that were provided to them that they're told at that point, you now have a debt to me and you need to work that off in some way. Possibility of a new life. You know, when we're talking about individuals, young girls that I'm working with that have been through the Children's Aid Society, that have a history of family trauma, that are living in poverty, they are going to take this possibility of something new, something that is presented as very glamorous, something that may, you know, bring them out of the province or out of the city that they're currently living in for something that might be better. They're going to take that risk. And I'm thinking about a young woman that I spoke, you know, that I worked with specifically, who thought that the man approaching her on Facebook, who was introduced to her by a young woman that she lived with in the group home, the idea of coming to Montreal to meet him for a week or so anyway, to see what life could be like in Montreal, where she'd never been before, was enough for her to want to escape some of the trauma that she'd been living with in her family, some of the difficulties she'd been having in that family. And so that really drew her to her trafficker in Montreal, where she was subsequently trafficked in Montreal and all through Ontario as well. Of course, the need to escape abuse, the need to run. So again, maybe it may lead to homelessness initially, and then somebody is prepared to scoop you up at that point and prey on that vulnerability. Very often, we are seeing someone from if it's internationally trafficked people, part of the trafficking group is somebody from their own culture, their own community. For young women, other young women are the recruiters. They are part of the trafficking because we are more likely as young women to feel comfortable going with her. And so somebody from our own community, our own gender perhaps, our own culture is part of the recruiters, part of the trafficking experience. In coercion, we're looking at, of course, threats or violence to the individual or your family, and those may be very explicit or may not be very explicit, but the person feels that whatever has been said to them is threatening to them or to their family. You need very little as a mom, for instance, or if you've got younger siblings, for someone to say that they know where your kids go to school, or know what that means. And so you are likely to accept that as a threat of violence. One young woman I worked with, the traffickers threatened to make a false allegation to law enforcement that her father was sexually abusing her and her sister, and that was enough to pull her back to her trafficker after she had escaped. So she felt that that was a real threat to her parents and a threat to his physical safety, and it was one of the coercion strategies that the traffickers used, understanding her connection to her family and her need to protect her family. For anyone, I think this is specifically so for internationally trafficked people, but also for Canadians, of understanding and knowledge of our laws. A lack of understanding that regardless of the type of business you're in, if you are a victim of a crime of violence, you have the right to law enforcement and the criminal justice system to respond to. And of course, for internationally trafficked people, this is even so. If they have no immigration status or precarious immigration status, and they're afraid that by law enforcement, they are likely to have immigration or Canada Border Security called on them. And this is a big source of advocacy for us, is trying to ensure that law enforcement recognizes just being out of status, just being an undocumented person, does not warrant a call to Canada Border Security. There is no obligation for us to contact immigration authorities, Canada Border Security in this circumstance, to report anyone who is undocumented. We may have a different situation if there's a warrant out by immigration, but just being undocumented, if you are a victim of a crime of violence, you have the right to expect that law enforcement will protect you and not report you to the authorities. So, of course, there is a lack of trust of authorities, but for Canadians or for newcomers, I think this is true. For the young women that I've worked with, the two 16-year-olds I spoke about earlier, those young people had Children's Aid involvement. They understood how to call 911. The issue was that they didn't trust us, which is really, really concerning, of course. And they stayed with their traffickers instead of making those calls. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we are missing something with these young people. I'm part of this system, so I'm not blaming any one of us. I'm saying our systems are failing. If a young person is staying with a trafficker, is getting beat up, is being forced to service 10 or 12 people a day before she calls us, any of us. This is a problem, and we've got to start addressing that and recognizing we're part of a problem in the way we're responding to young people or connecting with them in some way. I think another major issue is, as we spoke about earlier, for internationally trafficked people, the threats of deportation. They often get in debt. The traffickers and the recruiters often force them to pay sometimes tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of working in Canada. And if they have mortgaged their land and will lose that land, their family's land, if they are fired and deported, that is a threat to not only their safety, but their entire family's safety. And so we've got to really recognize that in our own work as NGOs, but certainly in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, understand the impact that threat of deportation has, and are those other violations along the continuum that we spoke about as well. And finally, I mean, the exploitation is really simple. They are using our victims, if you will, our survivors, to make money. That's what the traffickers are doing. They're often using them to take the risk of criminal charges, of course. They're going to force them to take the fall. So that's why I often am seeing women in the detention centers. They're using them, of course, for free labor. They're using them, and specifically in marriage trafficking I'm thinking of, they're using them for elevated social status and social connection. So I think I'm going to end there. I see that we're at 12:40, and I want to make sure we have enough opportunities for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Shelley. So yes, we have some time for questions now. So if any of our participants have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. And so we can just take a minute now and allow everyone to type their questions in. Shelley, in the meantime, while we're waiting, I do know that a lot of our membership also works with people who are already involved in the justice system, so perhaps on the offender side. So I was wondering if you have any insider strategies for people who encounter individuals who have become involved in the justice system due to their involvement in human trafficking.
So I think we're talking about two different groups potentially. We're talking about involvement with the criminal justice system because you have been found to be a trafficker, or somebody who, as a result of their trafficking experience, may now have charges of shoplifting or have drug trafficking of some sort or something like that. So, I mean, I think that it's really important to sort of understand what were some of the vulnerabilities that led the person to the circumstance they're currently in. And is there a way to now address some of those vulnerabilities that may still be there? Recidivism is one of the things that we have to consider then, right? And I even worry and know, one of the things that we're trying to combat is for the people that we work with to get back into an exploitive situation with somebody else. So we have to look at how do we recognize what the vulnerabilities are, and some of them are very practical because they're related to poverty, and how do we support somebody to mitigate those barriers. And so whether somebody is, currently in the criminal justice system, so working with probation, parole, for instance, et cetera, what are some of the vulnerabilities that may have led them there? What are some of the supports that you can put in place to mitigate some of those vulnerabilities? And then who are the other service providers that you can wrap around that individual to mitigate some of those circumstances again? And I think in that way we have a better chance of combating some of the recidivism that we might see.
Perfect, thank you. So we do have a few questions here. The first one is asking, will We Fight provide consultations for agencies across the province?
I don't want to say no to that, but one of the things that I think is really important, the Ontario strategy that came out a couple years ago has funded projects like We Fight across the province. Now, different communities are sort of at different stages. Again, we started in 2002, and I didn't have money for 10 years of doing this. So we're at a really different stage than I think a lot of communities are. But there very well may be an organization in your own community that is leading the efforts in your community. So I really would urge you to find out if there is an organization dealing with trafficked people in your community. But yes, if in the absence of that, and in recognition that very often trafficked people have to move for their safety, so they may be coming to Windsor, or they may be in your community now from Windsor, or the traffickers have moved them and they're found in a different community. I think it is important that we're sort of aware of each other as well. So that's another reason that I wanted to speak about We Fight, because you may have somebody that's moving to Windsor, and so you want to know who is the trafficking organization in my community. But many of us have, at different stages again, organizations in our communities across Ontario who are beginning or are experienced in tackling this issue of trafficking.
Great, thank you. So our next question is asking about how we can identify trafficking situations in public, specifically if there's any visual signs, such as ramshackled, boarded up houses or apartments.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good question. I mean, just from afar, I think it's difficult to note. I think in labor trafficking, one of the things that we have to think about is if we are seeing people who are being moved, very, very early in the morning, maybe before dawn, into a workplace, and then are picked up all together late in the evenings. That would be something that I would, consider if there's 15 people all getting into a van, at 5 in the morning, or getting to work at 5 in the morning and leaving at 10 o'clock at night. That would be something that I would consider. I think we want to look at some of the, the factors in the labor and the sexual exploitation continuum that we talked about earlier, specifically some of the unexplained injuries, those sort of things. If we're meeting with someone, I'm always really sort of conscious of people who are panhandling on the streets, for instance, and I'm sort of looking around to see if I stop and talk to somebody, or, I'm going to give change, if they're looking to see if somebody else is watching them, or if they look like they're constantly sort of deferring to somebody across the street, I'm sort of, way more conscious of that person and whether they're being exploited. But I think it's really hard to determine from afar what might be somebody in hiding for lots of different reasons, and whether that whether that is an indicator of trafficking necessarily. But those would be some of the things just in public that I would be looking for.
Great, thank you. So another person is, I think, just broadly asking, they're interested in more information about marriage and trafficking as they work with women who are incarcerated and would like to provide more information on this. Do you have any ideas about resources?
Resources, the two that I spoke about, the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario and the Barbara Schleifer Clinic in Toronto. At one point they had young women that they were working with that were involved as either potentially trafficked people in marriage or were trafficked women in marriage, did a really excellent graphic novel about their experiences and the fears, some of the fears around, for instance, part of the coercion in those circumstances were fear of being ostracized, of course, from your family, fear of not being able to have contact with your siblings. That type of coercion is very often used. And so they did a really excellent graphic novel sort of articulating what the progression sort of looks like of this type of violence. And so there are resources out there. I think one of the groups, yes, both in women who may be incarcerated, I think important for law enforcement who are getting those calls on domestic violence, but also, you know, education and prevention in our high schools. One of the signs that I would be looking for in those circumstances is a young person who perhaps, you know, come spring, perhaps the grades start dropping, perhaps she starts articulating that she may not be coming back to school next year. Those types of, you know, those types of signs might be articulated or seen, and then it's important for us to sort of reach out to that person and ask some other questions that are open to that provide that person an opening.
Great, thank you.
Can I switch the next slide? I just want to give the three questions that I think, oh, there we go. I just wanted, and I meant to stop here. These are the three questions that we posed, and many of our community partners use either in their intakes or at some point in their relationship with the client. And you could see that these three questions are sort of open, because I don't want to ask necessarily questions that are specific to a type of trafficking that I think the person might be in, because I want them to recognize, even if they're primarily trafficked in one industry, if they're being forced in another industry, to feel comfortable articulating that. So, and these questions, you know, they can be rephrased for, you know, the person asking them or for the person receiving these questions. But these have helped us in our community partners to sort of give a very open and non-intrusive way of asking questions that somebody hopefully feels comfortable answering either then or later on in their relationship. And it's helped to identify that they have been in a trafficking circumstance. It's up to us then to do further digging, further, you know, gathering of information and assessing their circumstances, but they're, you know, sort of simple questions that can be asked at an intake to help identify whether the person may have experienced trafficking.
Wonderful. Oh, these look great. Thank you. So another question here. Can you share anything about your experiences with people who have disabilities, intellectual or physical, as far as how that impacts risk or other factors?
Mm-hmm. Certainly those are additional risk factors because the traffickers, I will say, are very adept at assessing whatever vulnerability the person may be living with. So an intellectual disability, for instance, or a physical disability, the trafficker is very quickly able to discern that, and then prey upon that as a way to recruit them into a circumstance. So we work with our community partners here, and certainly many of the, I'm thinking specifically of the young women that I've worked with, have lived with along a continuum of intellectual challenges that were utilized in order to recruit them, in order to isolate them. and in order to force them into whatever industry the trafficker wanted them to move into. So again, it's a vulnerability that the traffickers will play on, and especially for young people that are living with those sort of vulnerabilities or those sort of challenges and have concurrent issues as well. So they may be also living with addiction issues. They may also be experiencing episodic homelessness. And so all of those in totality mean that that person has a lot of risk factors that are going to lend them to take a risk or lend them to believe that that this person is actually their friend and will help them.
Thank you. So we had a similar question, I guess, about mental health conditions that are more likely to be exposed or preyed upon. So I'm assuming it's similar to what you just said about additional vulnerabilities.
Yeah. And I just want to talk about trauma, though, in a mental health.
Sure.
You know, I think, you know, when we are working with people and that pre-existing traumas are not recognized, that is a huge risk factor, right? So we really have to begin addressing trauma early in a young person's life, as early as we can, to mitigate what has happened there, because that pre-existing trauma, the sexual violence, perhaps, you know, moving, you know, to various foster homes and the traumatic experience of that, not being successful in school, maybe you've moved many different schools, all of those are leading to mental health issues, trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety, that make you vulnerable to these traffickers. So it's really important that we recognize that, because the traffickers will take care of you, and again, I'm using quotes. So if you have a lot of anxiety and depression and you have somebody saying, I'm going to take care of all of this for you, you won't have to worry about a thing, and you are hopeless and helpless or feeling that way, then you are likely to be recruited in that circumstance. So we have to recognize those pre-existing issues.
Thank you. So another question here, they're saying victims will usually have a trafficker controlling their movement. So what are some ways that or how do they typically learn or become aware of resources available that can help them?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways. Yes, they do often have people controlling their movements. One of the biggest referral sources that we have are clients or former clients of We Fight. So other women who we're working with, at some point the traffic person, you know, may be seeing people on the street. The trafficker doesn't have to be with her 24 hours a day, and often isn't with her 24 hours a day. The threat of what will happen to her if she escapes is always with her. The omnipotence of the trafficker in her mind or his mind is always there. So they do get referrals. I worked with a young woman came to us a couple weeks ago, and she had actually gotten our name from a woman that we're working with months and months earlier, and she had been afraid to call. And then she saw a bunch of media that we were involved with another young woman that works with us, and she happened to see that media. And then when she was, her trafficker had forced her on a call, and she was in a cab driving to the customer, and she was driving past the downtown Mission, and she asked the cab driver to let her out. And she went in and asked to use the phone at the Mission and called us. And so that referral source from other people is crucially important. And it's really important for us to recognize the traffic people may be coming in to all different types of places. Hospital ERs. They might have to see their probation officer. They might be, you know, coming into their lawyer's office. And so that's why it's so important for us to sort of be open, maybe ask these types of questions so that somebody can come forward if they need to.
Great, thank you. So another question here is We Fight restricted to Windsor Essex area, or do you also serve Chatham Kent and Sarnia-Lambton regions?
No, we have about 100 individuals we're working with right now in Windsor Essex.
Okay.
So Sarnia-Lambton does have, I know, an anti-trafficking group there. I don't think that Chatham Kent does. I'm sorry. Not that we, again, won't provide some consultation or support to someone. I've certainly taken those calls from the Chatham Kent area, but I don't think you have a designated group like We Fight or a funded program like We Fight in the Chatham Kent area.
Okay. So it sounds like the resources available are very specific to the region.
Yes,
so
typically
perhaps,
they would be. They would be. The agencies that have been funded the programs are going to be jurisdictionally sort of restricted, if you will.
Okay. So I think that might be all the time that we have. So I wanted to thank you very much, Shelley, for joining us today. I think that was a really wonderful and insightful presentation. So just as a reminder to everyone, we will be making the slides available on our website as well as a recording of the webinar. So you'll be able to rewatch it and share it if you'd like. And we'll be sending it out in an email to the participants within 24 hours, so very likely tomorrow. So thanks again to everyone joining us today, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.